Okay, welcome to another test video on all matters financial operations and financial services. In this video, I will revisit a topic we've looked at several times before, the X and record date questions around dividends. But this time I'll do it slightly different and use a little bit more of a visual approach because it remains a confusing topic for a lot of people. I do assume some basic knowledge around the process. So for instance, on the left-hand side, you see a little table reflecting the specifics of a particular dividend, a record date of the 7th of June declared by the board of directors. That means that owners or holders of record on the 7th will receive a dividend. Assuming a 2-day regular settlement, that means the day before the stock will trade X. In other words, if I trade and buy on the 6th, I will not be holder of record by the end of the 7th, so I will not get the dividend. And furthermore, there are 2 weekends in there which really don't figure much into at least in this slide. We'll come back to that weekend in the next slide. But this is the basic situation. So the question could be something like this, for instance, right? Assuming a regular 2 business day settlement. When is the latest moment an investor can buy the stock and still receive the dividend? Well, a couple different ways of looking at it. One is with the perspective of the trade date, right? We know as long as I buy before the X date, we established that the X date is the day before the record date, June 6th. So as long as I buy before that date, let's say on the 5th or earlier, I will buy the stock that is trading cum dividend and I will receive that dividend. We can also look at it through that same trade through the perspective of a settlement date, because the settlement date is what tells us that on the 7th, the record date, I do have a settled position. So if I have a trade that settles on the 7th or before, in other words, which traded on the 5th or before, I will be entitled to the dividend. So both come up with the same dates as far as eligibility. It is just important to recognize, am I analyzing this being given a settlement date of a trade or a trade date of a trade? Now, we can flip this question on its head too. We can say, okay, well, what is the earliest moment for an investor to sell and still receive the dividend? Now, not surprising, this is kind of the mirror image of that middle block that we just did, the latest moment to buy. Because if the buyer gets the dividend up until trade date, the 5th of June, stands to reason that the seller is not getting it, right? If you sell before trade date the 5th, you will not own it as holder of record on the 7th. So the exact opposite as the first question. So again, through the perspective of either the trade date or the settlement date, if I sell with a trade that settles before or on the 7th of June, I won't get it. If I sell through a trade that has a trade date of the 5th or before, I don't get the dividend either. If I sell it later, I'm actually selling the stock X dividend, meaning I'm selling something where the future owner, the buyer, is not getting the dividend, so I'm getting it. Same logic, flip side of the first scenario. So far, we've looked at a regular settlement convention of 2 business days, right? Well, let's change that a little bit and see what that means. Let's look at what would happen if we had a same-day settlement or a cash settlement. And let's ask the same two questions, right? A cash settlement is nothing more or nothing less than a trade that settles on the same day it is traded, right? So again, if I want to see what the latest moment is to buy and still get that dividend, I still look through either the trade date or the settlement date perspective. Now, however, they are the same, right? Because if I trade anywhere up until and including the 7th, it will settle on the 7th, and therefore I am holder of record at the end of the 7th. So with a cash settlement, same day settlement, it stands to reason the difference between trade date and settlement date is essentially disappearing, right? That is the real difference between the first two blocks and this third block. The other difference is, as you can see here, we now have a different X date, because if I buy stock on the 7th for a cash settlement, I am entitled to the dividend. So it cannot trade X dividend for me at that point. So what does that mean? On a cash settlement, the X date is the first day following the record date. I know that sounds a little counterintuitive, but do the logic, run through it as far as when are you holder of record? When, and then when is the first day that if you buy the stock, you are not going to get the dividend? That just happens to be the first day after the record date. So for a cash settlement, the X date is the day following the record date. Okay, and again, if you flip the scenario around, so when is the earliest you can sell and still receive the dividend under a cash settlement scenario? Again, it's the flip side of the previous question, right? If I now sell any time up until and including the 7th, I will not get the dividend. The trade date equals the settlement date, so it happens to be on the same day. If I sell any time after the record date, I will receive the dividend because I still was holder of record on the 7th. And again, the X date, which is really an objective date for the security, must be the same for the buyer and the seller, just as it is in the first two scenarios. So here we're looking at again an X date, the day following the record date. Okay, now we can take one more variation on this whole scheme, and this is where it really is very similar to the previous slide, but let's just, for completeness sake, let's say that the X and record date are separated by a weekend, right? In this case, we have an X date of June 12th on a Monday. That makes the X date the business day before, or the 9th of June. And again, if we ask the same 4 questions, we kind of get the same 4 answers in terms of the concept. However, as you can obviously see now, the difference in calendar days is bigger simply because the weekend is squeezed in between there. So if the question now is when is the latest moment to buy and still get the dividend, right? That means on a trade date basis, if I want to buy the stock cum dividend, I have to do it anytime on or before the 8th of June, right? I need to have a trade that settles no later than the 12th of June. So again, it is the same way to approach it as we did in the previous slide, just the difference that here there is a weekend in between. And if we flip the scenario around and say, what is the earliest moment I can sell? Again, just like in the previous slide, we see that the eligibility for the dividend is exactly the opposite from the first scenario, which again makes sense, right? If I sell before the X date, or sell on or before um, the 8th, then I am not getting the dividend because I won't be holder of record on the record date. Same difference as in the first slide, the mirror image of the first question. And the same happens when we look at the scenario of a cash settlement, right? What is the latest moment to buy and still receive? Well, the trade date and the settlement date are now the same. That means I can buy on the record date, the 12th in this case, and because it settles on the 12th, I will be holder of record on the 12th. I will get the dividend. And again, as counterintuitive as it may sound, the X date then becomes the day following the record date. And again, just like with the previous 3 scenarios we went through, if we flip the question on its head and say, what is the earliest moment to sell? Again, it's the mirror image of the previous column where we say, okay, anytime that I sell for a cash settlement on record date or before, I will not be holder of record on at the end of the day. So the earliest I can sell is the day after the record date, which therefore makes that day the X date, similar to what we saw in the previous slide. So I hope this visual approach is just showing X and record dates in a slightly different light. It is a confusing topic because it can be approached and asked and analyzed in many different ways. But in these 2 slides, I think what I've tried to do is to give you the underlying concept that no matter which way it's being asked about, you will be able to determine not only the appropriate record and X dates, but also the consequences for a buyer or for a seller in terms of whether that individual is eligible to receive the dividend. I hope it helped. Thanks for your time and attention, and I look forward to hearing and seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.